Now we're in Section 3. This will discuss the Civil War amendments or the Reconstruction amendments and evaluate the role the poll taxes played on limiting freedom. In its origins, the Bill of Rights was only limited to the national government, but over time it also covered the state and local governments too. And this was done because some states would use their power to limit the freedom of Americans, in the case of African Americans and women specifically. Other amendments were added to protect all Americans. So let's talk a little bit about what's known as the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the United States and outlawed any forced labor except as a punishment of a crime. Now, what that means is, you ever see people on the side of the road picking up trash or something like that? It's in orange jumpsuits, and there's armed guards standing there, people, cops standing there watching them. They're not getting paid for that. People argue it's a form of slavery, but the 13th Amendment says it can be used as punishment of a crime. So in that situation, it is perfectly legal. The problem with this is that early on in the Jim Crow era, and even today, you can still argue this, but a lot of African Americans specifically are being targeted to go and have to do forced labor and being accused of crime. So the 13th Amendment worked, but it still had its drawbacks. The 14th Amendment defined a U.S. citizen as anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Now, we talked about this in Civics last year. Or actually, no, this is Civics. I don't know what I'm thinking. We talked about Civics this year, and a few chapters ago, where we talked about what a citizen is. Chapter 1. Anyone born or naturalized in the United States. It is the 14th Amendment. That's what this is. This was enacted because many states after the 13th Amendment passed black codes to keep African Americans from having certain rights. They would limit them, even though they were not allowed to be slaves anymore, they would still limit them and not give them the same rights as regular people, regular free people. And that was the whole idea. Because they weren't treated like citizens, the 14th Amendment was instituted to identify them as being citizens. The 14th Amendment also made it where the government cannot interfere with the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. The incorporation of the 14th Amendment guaranteed the same basic rights to all Americans. It basically says if you're an American, you're an American. It doesn't matter if you're white or black or Hispanic. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew. It doesn't matter. You have the same rights as everybody else. And that's the idea. And again, it's in theory, it's not perfect. There are situations where it doesn't work out that way. But in theory, that's the idea. The 15th Amendment states that no state may take away a person's voting rights on the basis of color, race, or previous enslavement. This specifically allowed African American men to vote. Now, if you notice, one thing missing there is gender, because women are still not allowed the right to vote. White women still don't have the right to vote at this point. And we'll get into that in a few minutes, but it allowed African American men to have the right to vote. Now, it's not going to be as easy as them going up and casting the vote. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Suffrage is the right to vote. So you hear about women's suffrage or African American suffrage or something like that. It's the right to vote. It's not about them suffering, which is what people typically think of it as. In practice, it only affected men. So African American men gained the right to vote before women did. And women, no matter the race, couldn't vote. The 17th Amendment was passed to give people the right to elect their senators directly. And that's where we do today, where we vote for our senators. The 17th Amendment legalized that. The 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. It gave them the ability to vote. It made it, African American men already could. It made it where women could at that point. The 23rd Amendment allowed the residents of Washington, D.C. to vote. The 24th outlawed the poll tax. Now let's go back to this. The poll tax is a requirement for voters to pay before casting a ballot. Basically, you had to pay money to cast a ballot. And the reason they did this is they knew that a lot of former slaves were poor. Plain and simple. They didn't have nothing because when they quit being slaves, they had to go and find help, find work. And a lot of times it meant getting right back in enslavement or being an indentured servant where you worked for someone for a amount of time and they gave you land and stuff like that. So a lot of African Americans couldn't do that. So the poll tax was specifically put on there to limit African Americans the right to vote. Even though they had the legal right, now they had to pay money. And there's also going to be other things. There were some terrorist things that was done, like the Ku Klux Klan would stand outside polling places as an intimidation thing. So when African Americans, they couldn't interfere. They couldn't take them and do something to keep them from voting, but they could burn a cross in their yard later, go and beat someone in their family, do something to them afterwards as an intimidation thing so they won't do it again. They stand there and watch to see who goes in, and then they would retaliate. And that was some of the issues African Americans had, even though they had the legal right to vote. The 26th Amendment made the voting age 18. That was because at the time the Vietnam War was going on, and they basically was like, well, these boys can fight for the country. They should be able to vote in the country. And so they made the legal voting age 18. And that brings us to the end of Section 3. So it kind of gives you an idea about the Reconstruction Amendments, some of these Civil Rights Amendments, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, the elimination of the poll tax, which was a hindrance to keep African Americans from voting. And so we will finish up this chapter with Section 4.